Trent Hargrove slammed his office door so hard the Venetian blinds rattled against the glass. He tossed a printed sheet across the desk toward me, his face twisted with something between contempt and satisfaction. "Your medical leave is revoked," he announced, loud enough for the entire floor to hear through the thin walls. "If you walk out for chemotherapy tomorrow, don't bother coming back." I still wore the hospital band from my last treatment, the plastic cutting into my wrist as a constant reminder of where I'd spent my morning. I could feel dozens of eyes on me through the glass walls of his office. My throat burned, not from the chemo this time but from pure humiliation. The fluorescent lights felt too bright, making my head pound. The question flashed through my mind like a neon sign. What kind of monster does this? My name is Liliana Hart, and 3 months into chemotherapy for stage 2 breast cancer, my manager tried to erase my right to survive. This is the story of how one compliance report opened a door that refused to close. 3 months earlier, I had sat at my desk in the claims processing department, trying to make sense of life after diagnosis. The words invasive carcinoma still echoed in my head from the doctor's office just 2 days before. Everything had happened so fast. The mammogram, the biopsy, the devastating phone call that changed everything. Human resources had been gentle then, almost motherly in their approach. Patricia from HR, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes, placed a warm hand over mine and promised, "You'll have full protection under FE. Take whatever medical leave you need. We're here to support you through this." Trent had even stopped by my cubicle that afternoon, placing what felt like a sincere hand on my shoulder. "We support our people here, Liliana. Focus on getting better. That's what matters most." I believed every word. I didn't know then that Trent Hargrove despised anyone who threatened his quarterly performance numbers. To him, people weren't people, they were productivity metrics on a spreadsheet. And I had just become a liability he couldn't tolerate. The first red flag came 2 weeks after my diagnosis when he called me into his office for what he called a quick chat. He leaned back in his leather chair, fingers steepled together in that way people do when they think they're being thoughtful, wearing that practiced smile that never quite reached his eyes. "I heard you'll be missing Fridays for treatment," he said casually, like we were discussing vacation plans or dental appointments. "That's going to be pretty inconvenient for the team. We have end-of-week deadlines, you know." He stressed the word inconvenient, like my cancer was nothing more than a scheduling conflict, a minor annoyance disrupting his perfect workflow. Then he asked the question that made my stomach drop. "Have you considered adjusting your chemotherapy to after-work hours? Maybe weekends? I'm sure the hospital has flexible scheduling." I laughed nervously, absolutely certain he was joking. Nobody could be that callous, that disconnected from reality. The smile never left his face. He wasn't joking. He genuinely expected me to reschedule cancer treatment around his departmental deadlines. That was the moment I should have known what kind of person I was dealing with. After my second treatment, I returned to work feeling like I'd been hit by a truck and dragged behind it for several miles. The nausea medication barely worked, and dizziness washed over me in waves that made the entire office tilt and spin. I gripped the edge of my cubicle wall, trying to steady myself, willing the room to stop moving, taking deep breaths to keep from vomiting right there at my desk. Trent walked past, coffee in hand, and paused just long enough to deliver his verdict with that trademark smirk. "If you're going to be dramatic about this, Hart, maybe you should just go home. We don't need theatrics in the workplace." His voice carried across the open floor plan, making sure everyone heard his assessment of my struggle. Later that afternoon, during our weekly team meeting where he reviewed performance metrics, he made an announcement that felt pointed, deliberate, designed specifically for me. "Some people just can't handle pressure anymore," he said, letting his gaze settle on me for a heartbeat too long before moving on. "In this department, we need people who show up ready to work, not people looking for excuses." My coworkers shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, eyes darting between me and him. Nobody defended me. They just looked away, suddenly fascinated by their notepads. I reported his comments to Human Resources the following Monday morning, my hands shaking as I filled out the formal complaint form. Patricia and another HR representative named Vanessa listened with concerned expressions, nodding sympathetically as I recounted everything. The inappropriate questions about rescheduling treatment, the public humiliation, the pointed comments in meetings. They scribbled notes on their legal pads and promised they would have a coaching conversation, with Trent about appropriate workplace conduct and the company's commitment to supporting employees through medical challenges. I left that meeting feeling cautiously hopeful, believing the system would work, that someone would finally hold him accountable. Nothing changed. If anything, Trent became colder, more calculated, more deliberate in his cruelty. My approved medical leave requests began mysteriously getting lost in the system, requiring me to resubmit the same paperwork multiple times. One was accidentally deleted from the database entirely, with no explanation for how that could happen. Each time I pushed back or followed up, he retaliated by piling more responsibilities onto my already overwhelming workload. Projects with impossible deadlines. Complex reports due the day after treatment when he knew I'd be too sick to work. Assignments that required my presence during scheduled medical appointments. He was systematically building a case against me, documenting my failures, while creating the circumstances that made failure inevitable, and I was too sick and exhausted to see it clearly. 6 weeks into treatment, he invited me to what I assumed was a routine check-in, maybe even an apology for his previous behavior. Instead, it was an ambush, a surprise performance review I hadn't been notified about, with no opportunity to prepare or gather my own documentation. "You've been unreliable, Liliana," he declared, sliding a typed document across his desk with theatrical flair. "Your performance has declined significantly over the past several weeks. Multiple missed deadlines, incomplete work, excessive absences." I stared at the sheet in disbelief, my eyes scanning the list of supposed infractions. Half the infractions he'd listed were dates when I'd been hospitalized for chemotherapy complications, severe dehydration, allergic reactions to medications, emergency treatments. Days I'd provided extensive medical documentation for. Days that were legally protected under federal law. Other items were projects he'd assigned the day before they were due, setting me up to fail. He pushed a pen toward me with one finger. "Sign at the bottom acknowledging receipt." My hand trembled as I picked up the pen, but something inside me, some spark of self-preservation, resisted. I set it back down on his desk. "I need time to review this with HR," I said quietly, my voice barely audible. His fake smile vanished instantly, replaced by cold fury. "That's your choice," he said, his tone making it clear he considered this insubordination. "But refusal to sign goes in your file as well." The day before hell truly broke loose, I submitted my leave request for the next day's chemotherapy session through the company portal, following the exact procedure I'd followed for every previous treatment. I attached all required medical documentation, the oncologist's letter detailing my treatment schedule, the hospital appointment confirmation, the updated FMLA paperwork. Everything by the book, everything perfectly documented. HR approved it at 11:12 in the morning. I received the automated confirmation email and breathed a genuine sigh of relief, feeling like maybe things were finally stabilizing. At 2 in the afternoon, Trent walked past my desk, hands in his pockets, actually humming a tune like he didn't have a care in the world. He paused beside my cubicle, glanced down at me with that smile that made my skin crawl and my stomach turn. "You excited for your little vacation tomorrow, Hart?" he asked, loud enough for surrounding coworkers to hear. The word vacation hit me like ice water. Not treatment. Not appointment. Not even absence. Vacation. Like I was heading to a beach resort instead of sitting in a chair for 6 hours while poison dripped into my veins. My blood ran cold. Something was coming. I could feel it in the air, heavy and oppressive like the pressure before a thunderstorm breaks. That brings us back to his office, to the moment that would change everything. He reached across his desk, picked up my printed leave form, the one HR had approved just hours earlier, and ripped it cleanly in half. Then he ripped it again. And again. He tossed the pieces into his wastebasket like confetti, watching them flutter down with obvious satisfaction. "You're not leaving tomorrow," he said flatly, his voice devoid of any emotion. "Not unless you want to collect unemployment. We have a major audit coming up and I need every person at their desk. No exceptions." My chest tightened. The edges of my vision went dark and swimmy. The air in his office felt too thick to breathe. All I could manage was a whisper, my voice cracking. "I have cancer, Trent." He shrugged, actually shrugged like I'd mentioned having a mild headache or a parking ticket. "And I have deadlines, Hart. We all have problems. You don't see me crying about mine." That sentence branded itself into my bones, searing hot and permanent. I would never forget those words, the casual cruelty in his voice, the way he dismissed my life-threatening illness as an inconvenience equivalent to his work stress. Through the glass walls I saw my coworkers watching, frozen at their desks. Some looked shocked, hands covering their mouths. Others pretended to type, eyes glued to their screens. One person, Marcus from accounting, mouthed, "I'm so sorry," when Trent wasn't looking. Trent followed my gaze toward the office floor and his smile widened, taking on a predatory quality I'd never seen before. "Let them watch," he said with genuine pleasure in his voice, savoring the moment. "Maybe it'll teach everyone what happens when someone thinks they're special, that the rules don't apply to them. Nobody gets special treatment here. I don't care what's wrong with you." The nausea that had been building in my stomach since I'd walked into his office climbed up my throat. I felt tears burning behind my eyes, hot and insistent, threatening to spill over and give him exactly what he wanted, proof that he'd broken me, that he'd won this twisted power game. But something shifted inside me in that moment. Not panic. Not fear. Clarity. Cold, sharp, crystalline clarity. If I collapsed on his floor crying, he won. If I fought him right here, right now, raising my voice or showing emotion, he'd twist it into insubordination or hysteria. So I did the only thing that made sense. I excused myself quietly, my voice steady despite everything, and walked to the women's bathroom on shaking legs. I locked myself in the farthest stall and cried until the rage and humiliation crystallized into something useful: determination. I wiped my face with rough paper towels, fixed my makeup as best I could with trembling hands, and walked back to my desk with my head up and my shoulders back. My hands weren't shaking anymore. Trent was back in his office, door closed, probably congratulating himself on putting me in my place, on establishing dominance, on showing everyone who was really in charge. I sat down at my computer and started working methodically, my fingers moving across the keyboard with purpose. I forwarded every single email between Trent and me to my personal account, hundreds of messages spanning months. Screenshots of the approved leave requests. Copies of the fraudulent performance review with the falsified dates. Photos of the torn leave form I'd retrieved from his trash later when he left for a late lunch. HR approval emails. Medical documentation. Text messages from the company system. Everything. Every digital footprint he'd left behind, I collected it like evidence at a crime scene. Because that's exactly what it was. This wasn't management. This wasn't even bad leadership. This was systematic abuse, retaliation against a protected employee, and I was going to document every single second of it. That night at home, I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open and a cup of ginger tea I was too nauseous to drink sitting untouched beside me. The house was quiet, too quiet. I researched company policies I'd never bothered reading before, wading through dense corporate language and legal terminology. That's when I found it, buried deep in the employee handbook under Section 14, subsection C, the Ethics and Compliance Incident Portal. I hadn't even known it existed in my 11 years at the company. The portal allowed completely anonymous submissions for reporting violations of company policy, legal standards, or ethical misconduct. No names required. No email addresses. No way to trace the report back to its source. No retaliation possible if they didn't know who filed. The system was designed specifically for situations like mine. Employees who feared speaking up openly. I opened a new report and started typing. No emotion. No exaggeration. No dramatic language. Just facts. Dates. Times. Specific quotes. Attached documentation organized chronologically. A calm, clinical account of everything Trent had done, every policy he'd violated, every law he'd broken. When I finished, my report was 4 single-spaced pages long. I read it twice, checking for accuracy, then attached all my evidence files in a compressed folder. I hit submit at 11:47 at night. Within 24 hours, something happened I hadn't anticipated, something that would prove far more devastating to Trent than I'd ever imagined. The compliance department didn't just open a new case based on my report, they reopened old ones. Multiple old cases involving Trent Hargrove that had been previously closed or dismissed by local HR. My report had triggered what they called a pattern review, an automatic process initiated when multiple reports share common elements like similar behaviors, similar victims, similar policy violations. The algorithm in their system had flagged his name, connecting dots that had previously remained separate and isolated. They weren't just investigating my specific situation. They were investigating him, his entire history, everything he'd done, everyone he'd hurt over the years. It was like pulling one thread and watching an entire tapestry unravel, revealing the rot underneath. The system couldn't be shut down once it started, couldn't be influenced by local management or departmental politics. It wasn't controlled by HR or by anyone in our regional office. Compliance reported directly to corporate headquarters in another state, operating independently with their own investigators, their own authority. Trent Hargrove had just become the subject of a system-wide audit, and he had absolutely no idea what was coming for him. Neither did I, honestly. I just knew the door I'd opened wasn't closing. 2 days after I filed the report, Trent called me into his office again. But everything was different this time. The power dynamic had shifted in ways he couldn't quite identify yet. His usual confidence had cracked. His hands fidgeted constantly with a pen, clicking it open and closed in a nervous rhythm. His voice had lost that commanding edge, that certainty that everyone would bend to his will. "Hart, did you file some kind of complaint?" he asked, trying to sound casual and authoritative but failing completely. His left eye twitched, a small, involuntary movement that betrayed his anxiety. I met his gaze steadily, my face a mask of calm indifference. "No," I said truthfully, keeping my voice neutral. I hadn't put my name on anything. The beauty of anonymous reporting, the protection it offered. "Why do you ask?" "Because someone is digging into my personnel files," he continued, sweat beading on his forehead despite the aggressive air conditioning that usually kept his office uncomfortably cold. "Someone from corporate compliance. They're asking questions about you, about your medical leave, about our interactions. They want to see all my emails." I kept my expression neutral, almost bored, as if this had nothing to do with me. "I don't know anything about that," I replied with a slight shrug. "Maybe it's just a routine audit. Don't they do those periodically?" He stared at me for a long moment, searching my face for cracks in the facade, for any hint of deception or satisfaction. He found nothing. I'd practiced this in front of my mirror at home. I had never seen Trent Hargrove sweat before. It was strangely satisfying. What Trent didn't know, what he couldn't have possibly known, was that compliance had forensic access to everything in the company's digital ecosystem. They discovered emails he thought he'd deleted months or even years ago. Emails permanently deleted from his sent folder, his trash, his archived items. Every location a normal user could access. But nothing is ever really gone from corporate servers, a fact most employees don't realize. They have backup systems that run automatically every night, archive protocols that store copies of every communication for 7 years for legal purposes, and data recovery tools that can reconstruct deleted files from fragments. Compliance restored every message Trent thought he'd buried, some dating back 3 years to when he'd first been promoted to department manager. Messages to other managers about pushing out weak links before their benefits fully vest, to save the company money. An email chain about how HR will look the other way if you document things right, and build a proper paper trail. Another joking about cancer excuses, and how employees always claimed medical issues when they just couldn't handle the pressure. Each deleted email was another nail in his coffin. And there were dozens of them. A digital paper trail of cruelty, manipulation, and calculated abuse that he'd thought was safely erased. He'd been so confident in his deletions, so sure he'd covered his tracks, so certain that technology would protect his secrets. The anonymous nature of my report created something unexpected. A ripple effect I hadn't foreseen, but that proved devastatingly effective. It emboldened other people throughout the company who had suffered under Trent's management. When compliance started asking general questions across multiple departments, conducting what appeared to be a routine investigation, people began coming forward with their own stories. Former employees Trent had forced out through manufactured performance issues. Current ones he was actively targeting. A quiet flood of testimonies appeared in the compliance portal over the course of a single week, each one adding weight and credibility to the investigation. Stories of retaliation, favoritism towards certain employees while punishing others, forged performance reviews with falsified dates and fabricated incidents. One woman reported he'd denied her bereavement leave when her father died suddenly of a heart attack because "We had a major product launch that week and I need all hands on deck." Another described how Trent had deliberately manipulated project timelines to ensure an employee would miss their son's high school graduation, then blamed them for having poor priorities and not being committed to the company. His right-hand man, a smug analyst named Brody Fletcher who had always laughed at Trent's jokes and participated in the mockery of struggling employees, suddenly went completely silent around the office. He stopped eating lunch with Trent. Stopped defending him in meetings. Stopped making eye contact. The rats were abandoning the sinking ship. Human resources, suddenly realizing their own exposure in this expanding investigation, turned on Trent faster than I could have imagined possible. Compliance had discovered that HR had received and dismissed multiple formal complaints about him over the past 5 years. 7 separate formal complaints from different employees, all buried or minimized, all resulting in nothing more than coaching conversations that changed nothing. Patricia and Vanessa were suddenly very motivated to cooperate fully and transparently with the investigation, desperate to show they hadn't been complicit in enabling his behavior. They released Trent's complete managerial file to compliance. Every evaluation, every complaint, every incident report, every warning that had been filed and ignored. I never got to see it officially, but Marcus in accounting had a friend in HR who whispered details over coffee. The file was absolutely damning. Past supervisors who had worked with him before his promotion had written things like, manipulative leadership style that creates division, retaliatory tendencies toward employees who question his authority, and creates hostile environment through public humiliation tactics. He'd been flagged for coaching multiple times over the years. Nothing had ever been done because his department consistently met its numbers. Results had mattered more than methods. Till now, HR was covering their own exposure by throwing him completely under the bus, providing everything compliance requested and more. Then compliance found something worse, something I hadn't even known to look for when I filed my original report. Financial discrepancies in Trent's expense reports spanning nearly 2 years. He had been charging thousands of dollars to his corporate card for team-building activities and training lunches that never actually happened. Restaurants that didn't exist with fake receipt images created in Photoshop. Hotels in cities he'd never visited for conferences nobody could verify attendance at. Consulting fees paid to companies with no web presence or business registration. Over 18 months he'd essentially stolen nearly $40,000 through fraudulent expense reports, systematically billing the company for personal expenses disguised as business costs. He'd been using the company card like his personal ATM, financing his lifestyle, confident that nobody checked manager expenses too closely or questioned department heads who produced good numbers. He was catastrophically wrong. Forensic accountants were now reviewing every receipt, every statement, every reimbursement claim going back 3 years. They found personal vacation charges, electronics purchases for his home, restaurant bills from date nights with his wife. What had started as an investigation into workplace harassment and disability discrimination had evolved into potential criminal fraud that could involve law enforcement. The door that refused to close was now swinging wider and wider, revealing rot nobody had expected to find. Including me. I just wanted to protect my medical leave and hold him accountable for cruelty. I'd accidentally exposed a criminal. Trent was finally summoned to a formal investigatory meeting scheduled for the following Thursday. Not a casual chat, not a coaching session, but a full disciplinary hearing with legal representatives present. He tried to reschedule, claiming a sudden family emergency that required him to travel out of state. Compliance refused flatly. He tried to delay the meeting, saying he needed more time to prepare his response and gather supporting documentation to defend himself. They refused again, stating that he'd had adequate notice and the investigation had already been delayed long enough. He tried to bring Patricia from HR for support and representation, claiming he had a right to have someone from the company present during questioning. Compliance refused that too, explaining that company policy required these meetings to be conducted impartially, without department interference or advocates who might have conflicts of interest. The door he desperately wanted to close, to control, to manipulate in his favor. It stayed wide open. I watched from my desk across the office as he walked toward the conference room on Thursday afternoon, pale as paper, clutching a folder to his chest like a shield that might protect him. His usual confident stride had been replaced by hesitant, shuffling steps. For once in his career, Trent Hargrove couldn't slam a door in someone's face. This one stayed open and he had to walk through it alone, knowing exactly what waited on the other side. While Trent fought desperately for his professional life behind closed conference room doors, I continued my chemotherapy treatments on the schedule my doctors had prescribed. The approved leave he'd tried to cancel was now completely untouchable. Compliance had flagged my entire file as part of an active investigation, making any interference a serious violation that could expand the case. Nobody was canceling anything. Nobody was even suggesting modifications. I worked half days when I felt strong enough, when the nausea and fatigue weren't completely overwhelming. My team, emboldened by Trent's obvious downfall and the visible protection compliance had placed around me, treated me with genuine kindness I hadn't experienced in months. Someone started leaving snacks on my desk, crackers and ginger tea and the specific brand of peppermints that helped with nausea. Another colleague, Stephanie, a quiet woman who'd been with the company even longer than me, started covering my afternoon tasks without being asked, just quietly taking things off my plate. Meanwhile, Trent roamed the office like a ghost haunting its former domain. He avoided eye contact with everyone. His booming voice that once carried across the floor demanding attention had gone completely silent. He looked broken, terrified, diminished, a shadow of the domineering figure who'd ruled through fear. He'd built his entire authority on intimidation and fear tactics. Now that foundation had crumbled completely and he had no backup plan, no real leadership skills, nothing except the bullying tactics that had finally caught up with him. 3 weeks after I submitted my report, Compliance delivered their final conclusion in a formal memo distributed to senior leadership. I wasn't in the meeting where they presented their findings, but the results were circulated in an official company-wide announcement the following day. The charges were absolutely devastating, more comprehensive than I'd ever imagined. Systematic retaliation against multiple protected employees over several years, fabrication of performance records to justify terminations, misuse of company funds totaling nearly $40,000, abuse of managerial authority to create hostile work environment, falsification of expense reports, and policy violations dating back 7 years to the beginning of his time in management. Recommended action: immediate termination with cause, no severance package, no references, flagged for potential legal review regarding the financial fraud, and referral to law enforcement for investigation of theft. They escorted Trent out that same afternoon, not wanting him in the building any longer than necessary. 2 security officers walked him to his desk, stood over him while he packed his personal items into a cardboard box under their watchful eyes, and walked him out the front entrance with 1 officer on each side. The same glass walls he'd used to humiliate me and countless others became the stage for his very public downfall. Every single employee on our floor watched him leave, standing at their desks or peering around cubicle walls. Nobody said goodbye. Nobody shook his hand. Nobody looked even remotely sorry to see him go. 2 weeks after his termination, I received a message that caught me completely off guard while I was at home recovering from a particularly difficult treatment session. Came through LinkedIn from someone named Amanda Hargrove, a name that made my stomach drop when I saw it. The message was short, desperate, and heartbreaking. My husband worked at your company until recently. Did something happen there? Trent won't talk about it. He just sits in the garage all day staring at the wall. We've been served papers from the company's legal department. They froze our bank accounts. Even our personal savings. I have 2 kids. Please, if you know anything about what happened, I need to understand. I stared at the message for a long time, reading it over and over. Part of me felt a genuine flicker of sympathy. She was collateral damage in his choices, an innocent person suffering for his actions. Her children certainly didn't deserve this. But the larger part of me, the part that had been humiliated and threatened during the worst health crisis of my life, remembered his face when he said, "And I have deadlines," after I told him I had cancer. I remembered him ripping up my approved medical leave. I remembered the smile on his face when he said, "Let them watch." I didn't reply. I wasn't involved in whatever legal proceedings the company had initiated. I had simply told the truth about what happened to me. Whatever consequences he faced now were the direct result of his own actions, accumulated over years of abusing his authority. I closed the message and never responded. The vice president of operations called me into her office on a Tuesday morning 3 weeks after Trent's termination. Victoria Brennan was a tall woman in her early 60s with silver hair cut in a sharp bob and the kind of steady, commanding presence that made you trust her immediately. She didn't waste time with small talk. She thanked me directly for my courage in coming forward, for using the proper channels, for trusting the system when you had every reason not to. Then she offered me something I absolutely hadn't expected: full paid medical leave for the remainder of my treatment with zero impact on my PTO balance or vacation time. A permanently reduced schedule when I returned to work if that's what I needed to maintain my health. Flexible work-from-home arrangements. And then she said something that made my throat tighten with emotion. "Once you're ready and fully recovered, Liliana, we'd like to offer you the Senior Claims Coordinator position. You've demonstrated the kind of integrity and moral courage we desperately need in leadership roles." The word leadership hung in the air between us. Me, the person Trent had tried to destroy, had called dramatic and unreliable, had publicly humiliated, was being offered a promotion into management. Not because I'd asked for it or campaigned for it. Not because of politics or connections. Because I'd stood up when it mattered most, even when it was terrifying and uncertain. 4 months after his termination, late on a Sunday evening, I received an email from a personal Gmail account I didn't recognize. The subject line read simply, "Please." I almost deleted it without opening, assuming it was spam or a phishing attempt. Curiosity and something else, maybe the need for closure, made me click. The message was from Trent. It was rambling, desperate, stripped of every ounce of the arrogance and authority I remembered. "Liliana, I know you filed the report. I know it was you. Nobody else had all that documentation. I'm not angry anymore. I can't afford to be angry. I just need help. Can you talk to compliance for me? Tell them I'm not a bad person. Tell them I made mistakes but I was under enormous pressure to perform. Tell them I have bills I can't pay now. My wife is leaving me. She filed for divorce last week. My kids won't speak to me. The company is suing me for the expense money. I might face criminal charges. Please. I'm begging you. I know I didn't handle your situation well. I'm sorry for that. But please help me now." I read it twice, then a third time. My hand hovered over the keyboard. For a long moment I genuinely considered responding. Considered explaining that he'd done this to himself through years of choices. That his cruelty toward me was just one incident in a pattern of abuse. That I hadn't destroyed his life. I'd simply reported the truth and he'd destroyed his own life through his actions. Then I remembered that day in his office. The smile on his face. The shrug when I said I had cancer. And I moved the email to trash without typing a single word. His door was closed forever and I hadn't even touched the handle. My last chemotherapy session ended with the traditional bell ring that cancer patients get to do when they complete treatment. My oncologist, Dr. Helen Wu, a petite woman with gentle hands and fierce determination, stood beside me smiling genuinely as I reached up and rang the brass bell 3 times. The sound echoed through the oncology ward. My team from work had surprised me by showing up unannounced. Stephanie, Marcus, even Patricia and Vanessa from HR looking genuinely happy for me. They brought cupcakes from my favorite bakery and a handmade banner that read, "You did it, Liliana," in colorful letters. I cried, but this time the tears came from relief and gratitude and overwhelming emotion instead of fear and humiliation and despair. After everyone left and I'd finished my final post-treatment checks, I stood alone in the parking lot of the cancer center, breathing in the cold December air. Snow was starting to fall in soft, fat flakes. My hair was starting to grow back, soft and fuzzy like a baby's. I felt physically weak but emotionally whole in a way I hadn't felt in months. Trent Hargrove had tried to take everything from me during the absolute worst period of my life. Instead, he'd accidentally given me something unexpected and precious. The knowledge that I was far stronger than I'd ever imagined possible. That standing up for yourself mattered. That institutions and systems could actually work when you knew how to use them properly. 6 months after achieving remission, I walked into my new office with Senior Claims Coordinator Liliana Hart on the nameplate beside the door. The space was small but entirely mine. A real desk instead of a cubicle, a window with actual natural light, and most importantly, a door that I could close when I needed privacy or quiet. I thought about Trent sometimes, but not with anger anymore. The rage had burned itself out, replaced by something calmer. I'd heard through the office grapevine that he was working at a small insurance firm 3 towns over, making a fraction of his former salary in a position with no management authority. His wife had divorced him. The company had settled the fraud case quietly to avoid negative publicity, but he'd had to pay full restitution plus penalties, the $40,000 plus interest plus legal fees. His professional reputation in the industry was completely destroyed. Nobody would hire him for management again. None of that gave me the vengeful satisfaction I'd thought it would during those dark days in his office. What gave me real, lasting peace was much simpler. I had survived. I had thrived despite his attempts to break me. I had built a life and career he could never touch again. I didn't get revenge by screaming or fighting dirty or stooping to his level. I got it by surviving, by using the systems specifically designed to protect people like me, by documenting everything, and by walking forward into my future instead of staying trapped in that painful past. When the door finally closed on Trent Hargrove, not through my actions but through his own, I didn't just step past it and move on. I walked confidently into a life he could never take from me. A life filled with purpose and integrity and the quiet, unshakable strength of someone who'd fought both cancer and workplace abuse and won both battles on her own terms. That was my real victory. Not his destruction, though he'd certainly destroyed himself. My victory was my continuation, my survival, my thriving. And it was more than enough.